Hi, I'm Max Grinnell. I'm out here in front of the Carroll Washington Library Center on South State Street. On this tour, we're going to talk about how immigrants and other new arrivals have transformed this area through their restaurants, their retail merchandising, their love of popular song, and the importance of libraries. I'm standing here on the third floor of the Carroll Washington Library Center on State Street. The library remains one of the most important public institutions in the city of Chicago, with its over 80 branches serving every community throughout the city. If you think about what makes a great city, you might think of those amazing public institutions like parks and libraries. The Chicago Public Library is one of those key institutions. Interestingly enough, the library had rather humble origins. Its first location was actually in a water tank. And from that rather humble beginning, we have the widespread brocade of branches that exist throughout the city. It's very exciting, and if you've never had a chance to visit your local branch, you might choose to do so. They've also had a range of programs throughout their history to serve new arrivals to the city of Chicago. Starting in the 19-teens, the Chicago Public Library Bulletin frequently published lists of new books that arrived in foreign languages, along with relevant periodicals. And since that time, their programs for immigrants have included citizenship programs, book clubs in different foreign languages, and a myriad of other exciting programs. I'd like to tell you a little bit about one of the Chicago Public Library's most important and crucial employees over its long history. Vivian Harsh was the city's first full-time African-American public librarian. She was a Chicago native who was fascinated with collecting the stories of the people and inhabitants of the city. After graduating from library school in Boston in 1921, she returned to the Chicago Public Library, and in 1932, she became the branch librarian of the Grover Cleveland Hall branch in Bronzeville. She had a number of tremendous accomplishments during her time as a librarian and archivist. One of her most notable accomplishments was when she received the papers of the Federal Writers Project documenting what would be called the Negro in Illinois. These materials were originally intended to be published as a large monograph documenting and chronicling the lives of African Americans, social activities, cultural activities, religious structures, political organizations, and fraternal organizations. Along with this crucial work, she also hosted a monthly salon where she invited writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston to share their thoughts and words and meditations. These works remain quite crucial and important, and you can find her collection at the Carter G. Woodson Regional Library. I invite you to go, peruse these offerings, and learn a little bit more about this tremendous work. Friends, we're going to head downstairs and make our way north on State Street to the DePaul Center to talk about how the Goldblatt and Rothschild families transformed retail in the city of Chicago. If you think about retail in Chicago, you might think about State Street, Michigan Avenue, and other retail corridors throughout the city. The city's first main retail avenue was along Lake Street in the Loop. A few decades later, Potter Palmer began purchasing land on State Street with the intent of building major stores and a hotel along that street. Since that time, the city has seen many large department stores come and go. Right now, I'm standing in front of the DePaul Center, which started life as the Rothschild and Company department store. If you think about the immigrant retailing experience anywhere in a large American city, you know that so many immigrants have done a tremendous amount to transform the retail landscape by starting stores large and small in every single neighborhood throughout the city. The Rothschild and Company department store was one of the true remarkable immigrant stories in the city of Chicago. Abram Rothschild was born in Germany and later operated a large business on the near west side with his family. They began thinking about a large department store in the late 19th century, and when their store opened in 1912, it was considered one of the most celebrated department stores in additions to the Loop. After 20 years in business, the Rothschild and Company firm exited the building, and they made way for a group of other immigrant entrepreneurs, Nate and Maurice Goldblatt. Chicagoans over the past century have many fond memories of Goldblatt's. I personally bought a number of tube socks and important home appliances from their store at 47th and Ashland. This one's considered a high water success to have a large immigrant-owned department store in the middle of the loop. While Goldblatt's closed their last store in 2003, in 1993 the former department store, which had a history with two different immigrant families, became the DePaul Center. Friends, we're going to head north on State Street, where we'll pause at the world's busiest corner and tell you a little bit about Chicago, That Toddlin' Town, the famous song that'll always be associated with this part of the city, and written by an immigrant. Do you know who Alfred Breitenbach was? Do you know Fred Fisher? Both of these names might draw a blank. But the man known as Fred Fisher wrote the song Chicago, That Toddlin' Town, in which he name checks the street behind me, State Street. And if you think about how we associate Chicago or any other city with a musical moment, a snatch of lyrics, a little bit of a jingle, it's no wonder that the song has been recorded over 500 times by reggae bands, jazz trumpeter Maynard Ferguson, and arguably most famously by that well-known New Yorker by way of New Jersey, Frank Sinatra. To tell you a little bit about the story of this song is to tell you about an immigrant. Born Alfred Breitenbach in 1870 in Cologne, Germany. This man, who would become Fred Fisher, had many careers before he became a songwriter. He had been in the Royal German Navy. He'd done a stint in the French Foreign Legion before he arrived in Chicago sometime around 1900. His story is a rather interesting one. A Billboard article from the late 1940s reported that Fred Fisher claimed to have learned the piano after one single lesson from an African-American entertainer working on State Street, which seems like a rather prodigious feat. The song name checks a lot of Chicago icons and locations of the time. The lyrics refer to the College Inn at the former Sherman Hotel, now the site of the Thompson Center. He talks about the hot jazz that they played there. He talks about African Americans strolling up and down on State Street. He really captured the spirit of what it meant to be in Chicago at that time. Friends, we're going to head across the street and talk about the history and importance of the former Carson Pirie Scott department store. I'm standing in front of what many Chicagoans may know as the Carson Pirie and Scott department store. It was the flagship location for many decades, and for Chicagoans from all over the world, the experience of coming here via passenger train, via L, via streetcar, and later bus and then automobile would be a highlight of any journey. To spend half a day or an entire day wandering its many floors, shopping for a mattress, looking for a consumer appliance, and maybe sitting here and having a meal at one of their restaurants. It really was a communal experience that many shared in during their time in the city. Interestingly enough, the original firm that occupied the building was the firm of Schlesinger and Mayer. Schlesinger and Mayer were two Bavarian immigrants who had come to set up a dry goods business in Chicago. Dry goods businesses were quite common up and down State Street. By the year 1900, there were over 3 dozen dry goods merchants selling their wares up and down this section of the street. Later, the firm of Carson Pirie and Scott came to inhabit this structure. The Carson and Pirie and Carson Pirie Scott were also immigrants, this time from Scotland. They had been employed in the dry goods industry for several decades before they took up the operation of this dramatic building and continued on the tradition started by Schlesinger and Mayer. One of the things that distinguished the immigrant experience in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century in Chicago was working shoulder to shoulder in close physical proximity. Whether it was in the stockyards or textile factories, men and women worked to create a variety of products ranging from textiles to finished meat products to other types of durable goods. I'm standing here on South State Street in front of the Singer Building, which for many years was the Chicago headquarters of this very famous sewing machine manufacturer. Certainly all the women who worked in this industry knew very well about the Singer sewing machine and its operation. By the 1920s, there were over 20,000 garment districts workers who worked in and around the near West Side and near the intersection around North and Milwaukee Avenues. Certainly one of the most important goals of this work is to create as many pieces as quickly as possible. Over the years, working in close proximity led many of these women to form close social bonds and also to engage in union organizing to successfully strike for better working conditions and better pay. While many of those firms no longer exist in Chicago, one of them still does today, and they are mostly well known for making face masks. Their name? Hart, Schaffner, and Marks. Friends, we're going to walk half a block north on State Street to talk about the former CD Peacock jewelry store and the role of English immigrants to Chicago. Friends, we've just come from talking about the Singer Company headquarters down the street on State Street. Their most famous product? Of course, sewing machines. Used by tens of thousands of garment workers in Chicago and other large American cities, men and women toiling alike to make thousands of mass-produced garment items. Well, what about those smaller stores that made high-end luxury goods for an even smaller number of Chicago's elites? It's appropriate that I'm standing in front of the former headquarters of the CD Peacock Jewelry Company. Starting in 1837, Elijah Peacock had Chicago's first high-end jewelry business. His first location was nearby on West Lake Street. His move to the Palmer House to be part of this tremendous retail enterprise constituted a major shift in the jewelry business for Chicago. The firm had been involved in making high-end boutique pieces for a number of Chicago's industrialists and most well-to-do. Their number included Marshall Field, Potter Palmer, and much later visitors like Mick Jagger. Peacock was an arrival from England. Now, at no point were English immigrants to Chicago more than 3 to 5% of the city's population, but they constituted an important elite class of merchants, business people, and high-end manufacturers. One of the things I always look for in my work as an urbanologist is those documents that tell a little bit more about these people, these immigrants who transformed Chicago. So, while I was looking around doing the research for this piece, I found a long section describing what the man Elijah Peacock was about. And it's taken from E.O. Gale's Reminiscences of Early Chicago. And this is how he describes Mr. Peacock. Elijah came here in 1837 and engaged in his trade of jewelry and watch repair, a calling that had already descended through 3 generations following the English custom, and which his son Charles, C.D., who was born in 1838 and who's been one of our leading men in that line, tells me will be continued indefinitely as his mantle is slipping from his shoulders onto his sons. Now, of course, there were other things than jewelry needed in this new country, and one can picture the pleasures of the housewife torn away from the comforts of the old homestead down east at being enabled through the grand house of Peacock to set her table with a Sheratonian tea service or a Boardman coffee set, not to mention the soup tureens, hot water dishes, ewers, basins, trays, and candlesticks needed throughout the home. The House of Peacock enabled upscale clientele to purchase some old world elegance. I'm standing in front of the Berghoff here on West Adams in the Loop. This place has a special resonance for me, as it does for many other Chicagoans, because along with family celebrations and gatherings, it's also where I had a graduation dinner from college. It really is an important gathering space and has been since it opened in 1898. It's also part of a broader trend of German immigration to Chicago and the upper Midwest. Starting in the 1840s, the German population, which began as a trickle, began to grow and grow until the beginning of the 20th century. By the year 1900, 1 in every 4 Chicagoans had German ancestry, almost 500,000 people. So it made sense that Germans, who had been long known for their business acumen, would start a wide range of businesses, including restaurants. The story behind the Berghoff is a rather interesting one. Herman Berghoff was born in 1870 and made his way to Chicago in time to sell beer as part of the World's Columbian Exposition. Obviously, beer was a very common and popular drink among the laboring class, particularly among immigrants. He also was a little bit of an innovator when he, along with other tavern owners, decided to give away a sandwich with every beer. It was a very popular way to keep customers coming back for more. And certainly as the business grew and expanded, other bars, restaurants, and taverns saw this as a model for success. And certainly there could be no greater success than having your own restaurant here in the Loop. German food began to fall out of favor in the 1970s. Americans became a little bit calorie conscious, concerned with low-cal options and healthier dining more generally. The Berghoff still stands as testament to that spirit of what the Germans refer to as Gemütlichkeit, or congeniality. And certainly this spirit can be found at the Berghoff today. Next, we're going to make our way north to Heald Square, where we'll talk about the public art there that's also part of Chicago's immigrant tradition. I'm standing in front of a statue of 3 men whose role in the American Revolution cannot be overstated. Robert Morris, George Washington, and Chaim Salomon. Chaim Salomon may be the least known of the 3 men on that plinth. Born in 1740 in Poland, Chaim Salomon escaped anti-Semitic sentiment in his native Poland, moved to Holland, and then moved in 1775 to join the Sons of Liberty in New York City. He was impressed and emboldened by the spirit of the American Revolution. His crucial role, you might ask? He provided the funds to pay General Washington's troops throughout the war. It was a crucial role and one whose importance cannot be underestimated. So perhaps the next time you find your way through Heald Square, you'll stop and pause and remember this man who helped transform the United States of America. Also, this is part of the Statue Stories program. So if you walk by with your phone and use a QR code, you can hear Chicago native Bob Balaban tell you a little bit more about Chaim Salomon. Friends, during this walk along State Street, we've heard stories of immigrants who made successes in retail merchandising, those who transformed the lives of others through their garment making, and those who provided us with food when we were hungry. I'd like to conclude this tour by offering a little haiku I came up with along the way. We went but a mile, past those stories writ in stone. Together, we walked. Thank you.